Hello, my name is Ben Schultz, and this is a video for Sean Caroll and Nick Bostrom. You guys are both on the Joe Rogan Experience. Nick, you were on 1350, and Caroll, you were on 1352. Both of you guys talked a lot about philosophy and some physics and quantum physics and that kind of stuff, and a lot of times when I watch Joe Rogan's show, I get frustrated just because I'm not in the room and I can't add to the conversation. And I feel like there's certain things that are going unsaid that I don't know if they're just not thought about, or maybe I'm the stupid one and they're overlooked for a good reason. But I just thought I could put out this video and maybe you guys would see it and actually respond to it, and maybe get some conversation going or some questions answered. So I'm an artist. I'm not a scientist or a philosopher. I have a bachelor's degree for game art and design. So I'm not a scientist. I'm not going to make any assumptions that I know what I'm talking about, or that I have these great ideas that you haven't thought of. Obviously, you guys are professionals in those fields. But I am interested, and I wanted to ask some questions for both you guys. So specifically, Sean Caroll. I just finished watching your episode, though. I watched about half of it, and then I went back and started over, and I was taking notes as I was watching it. So you talk a lot about, obviously, quantum theory. That's your specialty. And you went into the different sort of interpretations of quantum theory. And so right off the bat, obviously I'm not qualified to make this assumption, but I don't really... The whole spontaneous wave collapse idea, I forget what you called it, but that one where different wave functions just sort of spontaneously collapse or ignite or whatever, that just doesn't make any sense to me, because for one, my understanding is science is usually the simplest answer is correct, and that seems like it adds variables to raise more questions. You're making it more complex to explain a theory, which just kind of indicates to me that doesn't really make any sense. And you say you're a multiple worlds person, Sean, so that makes sense. We're on the same page there. I don't know if that's why you disagree with it. But to me, it just, it sounds like it's overly complicated. You got stuff like if certain things spontaneously become more energized and they give more heat, like you say, in that theory, energy isn't conserved. That just kind of breaks entire models, so where's the energy coming from? So For the intents and purposes of my questions and discussions and comments, I just want to make it clear I'm on the multiple worlds theory of quantum theory, and just so we all understand each other, I don't know what I'm talking about. So here are my ideas. Basically, and the reason I'm going to tweet this out to Nick Bostrom too, is I wanted to present my own personal theory that has to do with kind of a philosophical theory of how reality works, and that relates to quantum theory and philosophy. So Nick Bostrom talks a lot about the simulation theory, and he talks a lot about things like data constraints and simulated minds, and basically how to optimize data and how you wouldn't need to simulate the whole thing, and therefore you basically wouldn't need to run every single algorithm to simulate every single atom at once, so it's possible that everything is simulated. But I've never heard somebody talk about simulation theory as if perhaps it's some sort of organic, natural simulation. It is a simulation that we're all experiencing, but that is just how the universe works. Our consciousness is experiencing a simulation for some reason, and that's a natural occurrence. And I was actually excited to hear Sean Caroll talk a lot about quantum physics in certain respect to that. At least, that I related it to that. So I agree with you, Sean, that we can understand everything, or I think our brains are suitably capable of understanding the whole nature of the universe and all of that. I think that we are limited by our experience, in the sense that we would need to articulate things in abstracts because we can't fully grasp. It's kind of like the idea that you can't literally grasp the idea of infinity, or like you were talking about, there's different reference points to understand data. Like, you don't need to understand the wave function of every single atom on the Earth. You just need to understand the relative position of the Earth, and then you kind of extrapolate things from that. It's emergent. So I agree with you on that. You can't understand everything literally, physically, objectively, especially because you're a conscious being that's having a subjective experience. But you can effectively understand everything from reference points and metaphors and abstract models to sort of best. You can understand them in those ways. So let's see. I have like 3 pages of notes, so excuse my disorganization. They weren't super linear in how I wanted to outlay it for you. So for the start, I think we're going to go into a couple of things I was confused with that Sean Caroll was saying. He was saying things like every single wave function that condenses or stabilizes in, so like an atom or an electron now has a determined position. It's not superposition anymore. It's not infinite potentialities. It's like stabilized. He was laying out some rules, like electrons could never become protons and stuff like that. And I understand that sentiment, but I didn't understand why he glossed over it, in the sense that like if every single wave function has like kind of an infinite, because it's a superposition and there's all these different ways it gets stabilized, and every one of those is a different universe, why couldn't there be different universes that have physics that just behave differently? So like obviously it doesn't make sense for an electron to become a proton to us, but I don't understand why he's ruling out the idea that there's no such thing as any reality, where that's just some quirk of physics that like wave functions can like invert and become from negative to positive. And obviously I don't understand how that stuff works very well. So that's just a thought I'd throw out there. If there's infinite possibilities, how come you're making the assumption that physics works the same way in all these different realities, just as a fundamental level? So that's just one thing to think about. So going back to my idea that we are in a simulation that is natural, when he was talking about all these potentialities, the wave functions distilling, and I'm using weird language because I'm not a physicist and I don't know how to best articulate it, but basically whenever wave functions collapse and it's not in superposition, and so something is determined and defined, he was talking about how that's just happening constantly, which makes sense because obviously there's just so many atoms and everything, like electrons within those atoms, that make up everything around us. But I was thinking in terms of time and space. People, physicists describe it as space-time because it's kind of one phenomenon. Gravity determines temporal warping or time dilation. So it's almost like the effect of space, the effect of gravity on space determines the rate at which time unfolds. And our experience of time is only linear because we're having all of these emergent wave function collapses that determine our reality. So I was thinking in terms of like, is it possible that our experience of time is just sort of like the culmination of every single moment? And of course it's weird to articulate things in terms of time when I'm talking about how time works, possibly. Is it possible though that every single time a wave function collapses and it's not in superposition anymore, we now experience that reality as whatever it's determined, but our experience of time is literally just to connect the dots of not an infinite, but every single moment is a new collection of those superpositions collapsing into one defined state. So is it possible that time is just our experience of our kind of moving between different possible universes in successive fashion? So if you laid it out in a graph, it'd just be like every single particle or every single electron has a superposition, and then once that collapses, that's one universe, and it goes in the other direction, and that's other universes in a different possibility. And our experience of reality and time is literally just like connect the dots between whichever one happens to unfold in our experience. And all the other versions of us or whatever, they have sort of a different zigzag of those connect the dots. That's just an idea. I don't know if that makes sense or anything. So let's see, what else do I have here? So you talk about Sean Caroll again. Most of this stuff's going to be Sean because I just listened to that one, and that's more tangible stuff. It's quantum physics and not just philosophical musings. But he says, insisting on how things work is what holds us back, and I really intensely agree with that. But at the same time, you were using language that it sounded very deterministic, like you were, or very set in stone. Like you would say things like, "We know this, we know that," and it seems to me that, and you yourself, you say you're an atheist. I feel like that's at odds with that thinking, that insisting you know how things work holds us back, and yet it sounds like you're insisting that you know how a lot of these things work, while also saying we don't know how it works. It's a black box that we just know how to use. And I agree with you that we can know how it works, but I'm wondering if that sort of mentality among a lot of people is what's the very thing that's holding it back. Because I think that a lot of scientists are trying to solve all these things materially, but at the same time, you should know better that everything isn't material, even if that's abstract. Because let's say something like an idea, you could say that is an idea is a material thing. It's a certain neuron pattern or chemical composition of neurochemicals in your brain that makes the idea, but that isn't the idea. That's the expression of the idea that you can see affecting your material brain. But the idea might be something like, I don't know, a new type of pancake recipe or something. Whatever it is, like, my phone call. That's the idea. It's not the material expression of the idea. So you would need to have the context if you were doing to map those things. Like you would need to understand that certain ideas express themselves as neural patterns, and sometimes the idea is actually more. That neural pattern is just a reference point. So that's just one thought to throw out there. So you also talk about how quantum mechanics is really interesting because it's a really cool tool that humans have invented. And I think that is something to focus on as well. Everything that science uses is something humans have invented. So this is where, in my thinking, it starts to get kind of philosophical. If you keep in mind that every single tool we have to try and understand the universe around us is with a tool that we have created, you have to concede that it's not that it's a crutch, but it's not going to fully articulate the information that you're trying to collect, because you created it to do a certain function, and therefore it isn't doing other functions that you didn't create it to do. So something like quantum physics, or even just basic math, like math is a way of describing things, right? Like 1 + 1 is just another way of saying 2. And you can use those systems because when you're missing variables, you can infer them from the rest of the equation. But keeping in mind that all of those are human tools that we've created, I just don't think you can have too much confidence in that kind of stuff. And I know in science, like, you are constantly creating new equations and new algorithms and new, ways of thinking about stuff. But I think the separation between material science and philosophy is sort of holding us back. This is again why I included Nick Bostrom in this video. I think that philosophy, if you were to think of it from a kind of a pragmatic standpoint, what philosophy is an exercise in abstract logic. So philosophy is trying to solve problems just with thought experiments, but those thought experiments are trying to approach problems from unique perspectives that you might not otherwise approach them. And as such, I think that philosophers and scientists would work well together, because it seems to me that philosophers are the ones who figure out the questions to ask, and then the scientists are the ones who answer those questions, or try to answer those questions, or hit the roadblocks so that you can examine new questions and then maybe change the question itself. And I would imagine Sean Caroll agrees with this. And that was nice to hear from a scientist instead of these people who insist that they already understand how everything works, and people who don't understand philosophy kind of bashing it, which is always frustrating. Sorry, my notes are really out of order here. So I put a note here when you were talking about how even if you could determine every trajectory of the universe, when Joe was talking about how if there was a machine where you could literally map every bit of data in the universe, you could effectively predict the future and map the past. And you were saying how, while that might be true of the whole universe, if you can understand the wave functions of everything, just because you can understand the universe doesn't mean you can understand you or your past or where you were going in the future. I thought that was an interesting idea because it kind of indicates that your experience is unique to you, and that kind of ties into like my initial idea of the whole like connect the dots thing. And so it's kind of like you can map a universe, but it's almost like the universes are outside of time, because if every single collapsing wave function creates a universe, then that universe sort of exists in isolation, and potentially, I think maybe our consciousness, whatever form that is moving between universes constantly. And obviously we wouldn't perceive that, but if it's just a series of collapsing wave functions that we're experiencing, again, assuming that we're in some sort of simulation, then we could just be moving like between potentialities. And so our experience of that creates this cohesive narrative, because our brains, we're narrative machines. Like, we don't understand anything unless it's put into some sort of context or some sort of narrative. And so, I don't know, kind of an abstract idea. It's not even really fully formed, but I just thought that was something interesting. This video's gone on way longer than I intended, so I'll just try and wrap it up. So I want to know both your guys, Sean Caroll and Nick Bostrom. I want to know your guys' idea on the idea that maybe there is a simulation that we're all in, but it is a natural occurrence in the universe, and then our experience of it is what creates sort of our perception of linear time and how events unfold. And that's why it's so hard to track, is because potentially it's moving between different realities and stuff. I did like that Nick Bostrom did talk about video games. That's my expertise. I was, game art and design. I don't know if Sean Caroll knows about this kind of stuff, but it is interesting comparing it to a video game, because a video game is a simulation, but you're not having to render the whole thing all at once. It's just whatever the camera's facing, whatever's on screen at once. And so I do like that idea, and I think it relates to quantum physics in the sense that whenever these wave functions collapse, once they're measured in some way, and in my understanding, it doesn't have to be like a person looking at it. It could be a camera or whatever. So forget about the idea of consciousness or any of those implications, but it seems to me that supports the idea that it's a simulation as relates to like video games and stuff, because it's almost like all these wave functions exist in superposition until they are needed to be defined within the simulation. So once they are needed, because you're using them as a reference point, you're measuring them, like they need to exist in some defined state to reference something else. That is when that superposition collapses. And so it's almost like they're all just waiting until they're needed by the simulation, and then they define themselves. So in my ignorant, very limited experience with this kind of thing, I thought that was an interesting idea. So I also thought it was interesting that Sean Caroll specifically talked a lot about how to get people more interested in this stuff. I didn't know that it was only like 100 people working on this. That really bums me out, because I think it's fascinating. I don't really have the desire to learn all the math and do it actually academically to be invested in this field, because I'm more of an art person and creative and that kind of thing. But I think that all ties together. I think everything ties together and everything's connected. And you were talking about that, how when you learn other podcasts, or when you watch other podcasts and learn things like economics and that kind of stuff, you're like, oh, like this relates to my field in this way. I find that all the time, and I'm just an artist. I just make up bullshit that I think is cool, but I'm incorporating physics and economics and cultures and philosophy and all this stuff into my art and into my narratives, and I'm hoping that what I can do is turn that outward, and that will answer your question, Sean Caroll, how to get more people interested. I think if we can create enough people with a broad enough network of overlapping disciplines, you got philosophers and scientists and artists and whatever, if we can all work together to make a piece of entertainment / education, because I really think those should be like one thing. Like, nobody's going to learn anything if they don't find it interesting. So I think it's really irresponsible to create pieces of education that just aren't engaging, because only the people who are predisposed already understand the relevance of that topic are going to be engaged because they want to learn it. But most people don't know why they should want to learn something. So I think they need to be entertained, and they need some sort of context of why it's relevant or important or relatable to them. So that's what I'm trying to do. I'm writing a book. It's a fiction novel, But I try and incorporate a lot of these things into it because my whole dream is if we lived in a world where everybody was just being inspired constantly, and then we can have inspiration sort of exponentially escalating things on our whole species. You know, if everybody is just constantly consuming this entertainment like we already do, but most of it's fluff and bullshit. If we could create a piece of entertainment that people consumed and it made them think, and they're like, oh wow, like I didn't know, you know, I never experienced that. That's really cool. And then you find out like, oh, that's based on real science. Like this, you know, fantasy or whatever that you're watching, like it could be that way, but we don't know enough to understand if it is or not. Then that would, I think, stimulate more people to be involved. So, yeah, those are just some thoughts. I apologize for how discombobulated I am. I really should have rewritten these notes in like a linear fashion to lay them out. But, you know, if you guys have any responses or even if you even watch this video, I would really appreciate it. You know, check out my art, tweet me back, and I would really enjoy hearing back from you guys. I hope that any of this made sense. So please message me back and get back to me with thoughts and questions or anything like that. I'm really kind of starved for conversation. I don't have a lot of people in my life that want to engage in these kinds of things. I mean, even in your circle, Sean Caroll, you work in this field and there's still only like 20 people at a conference. So imagine how I feel. I'm just all alone out here and I'm just some weird art guy who makes up weird fantasy stuff and is always ruminating on these things. You know, it drives my wife kind of crazy. She does her best to keep up with me, but I really would like a group of people I could talk with to engage with this kind of stuff. So if you've taken enough of your time, thank you for watching the video if you do, and please get back to me with any thoughts.